We're holding for 5 because someone said there's crazy traffic, and I told Yolanda, and Raylan's like, so I have a question. Why did you let me worry so much about numbers and filling spots? I don't like the way you put that question on me.
Controlling you, so just trust your colleagues, Scott. But I understand where you are. I understand
Where I was.
Where you were.
Right.
Where you were. I totally understand, and I don't want to be next to the mic.
I'd love to see you.
Hopefully I have enough light.
Is that your right?
Good evening, everyone.
It's not your right, is it? At least you're right. Okay.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Matthew McClendon, the director and CEO of the McNay Art Museum, and it is my great honor to welcome you to the McNay's 25th Tobin Distinguished Lecture, a celebrated program of the Tobin Theater Arts Fund, inaugurated in the year 2000 with a lecture by the esteemed designer Ming-Cho Lee. This is a special year for us at the McNay. It not only marks the 70th anniversary of the museum, but also the 40th anniversary of the Tobin Wing, donated by Margaret Batts Tobin in 1984 to celebrate the 50th birthday of her son, Robert L.B. Tobin, namesake of the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts. Mrs. Tobin's gift laid the foundation for the equally remarkable collection of scene and costume designs later gifted to the McNay by Robert Tobin between 1998 and 2005. In the Tobin wing, exhibitions continue to explore the full scope of both the Tobin collection of theater arts, a significant part of the McNay's permanent collection, and engage San Antonio in a celebration of excellence in theater arts, embracing design for opera, ballet, musical theater, and drama from the Renaissance to the present. Generous support for the Tobin Theater Arts Fund generous support from the Tobin Theater Arts Fund enables us to present engaging and educational programs like this, free and open to the public. I'd like to take a moment to thank Mel Weingart, President of the Tobin Theater Arts Fund, Linda Hardberger, Secretary of the Tobin Theater Arts Fund, and Robert Perziola, Director of the Tobin Theater Arts Fund, for their unwavering support of the McNay and its renowned theater collection. Thank you. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Bruce Bugg, Chairman and Trustee of the Tobin Endowment, for his support of the museum, Tobin Theater Arts curatorial position, and special projects. Thank you, Bruce. And thank you all again for being here tonight with us and supporting the museum. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Scott Blackshire, curator of the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts, to share a bit more about our special guest tonight. Thank you. Scott?
Thank you, Matthew. Ooh, the lights. Thank you, Matthew, for the introduction. And before we get moving on with the lecture, as always, I do need to thank a handful of colleagues for all of their work, specifically Katie Leon, Head of Development, Janelle Esparza, Head of Education, and Yolanda Urabazo, our Head of Marketing and Communications, for their efforts. And for Julie Magera, Development Manager, Miguel Trevino, Education Manager, and Aisa Hernandez, Manager of Communications and Marketing, for all of their heavy lifting. And then, as always, the boots on the ground, my multimedia colleagues in the booth, Paul Feuerbacher, Clayton Price, and Maggie Cruz. They make us look and sound good. And then there's my curatorial colleagues, Renee Barrio, our Head of Curatorial Affairs, who helps usher exhibitions like this through years in advance. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Remus Moore, who's just joined us as the new Tobin Theater Arts Fund Assistant Curator. So now, as we celebrate this 25th anniversary of the Tobin Distinguished Lecture, I too would like to add thanks to those that Matthew gave to Mel Weingart, Linda Hardberger, and Bob Perziola, the Tobin Theater Arts Fund, for their ongoing support for this lecture program and the McNay's Theater Arts exhibitions. Today, the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts is one of the finest of its kind in the world. And the collection continues to grow with the support of the Tobin Theater Arts Fund and, as Matthew mentioned, the Tobin Endowment. The heart and soul of the collection remains its namesake, the late Robert L.B. Tobin, regardless of how many of us take up the mantle of his life's work. I like to repeat a quote from Robert Tobin that I learned when I first started in this position. Robert said, "I have an intense desire to see the theater designers recognized on the same level as visual artists." And I'm really happy to say that the McNay Art Museum does that. To that end, Robert stewarded a collection that, as Linda Hardberger has reminded me, is rich in its depth and breadth. It's broad in that the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts represents 500 years of excellence in the theater arts. And with regard to the Ballets Russes particularly, the depth of Robert's collecting is seen in the works of Léon Bakst and Alexander Benoit, through a treasure trove of Natalia Goncharova artworks, Mikhail Larionov, the leader of the Russian avant-garde, and all the way to Pablo Picasso's designs for Pulcinella and Le Tricorne. The fall exhibition, Women Artists of the Ballets Russes, will celebrate artworks that represent this exquisite core of the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts, born from the generosity of Robert Tobin and that we all enjoy today. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Caroline Hamilton, and before I introduce her, I want to say hello to the small contingent of viewers out there in Boston and in Australia, where Caroline's family and former ballet teacher have gathered to listen to and join us today. So that's amazing. So Dr. Hamilton is an Australian-born historian and curator specializing in the early 20th century ballet and the evolution of dance and costume. She has written extensively on ballet and costume, and her doctoral thesis examined the design and impact of George Balanchine's short-lived ballet company, Les Ballets, 1933, through surviving costumes and ephemera. Now, it's through the surviving costumes and ephemera that Caroline and I got to know each other 5 years ago when I started in this position. Caroline was at the Harry Ransom Center doing some research, and I invited her here to come look at our Ballets Russes costumes. And we had an amazing time. It was the first time as the new curator that I'd gotten to see them. So it was wonderful to look at them through her lens, have her open up a costume, see the writing in a waistband, and tell me that it was this dancer and this ballet captain and this maker. I was thrilled. At the same time, I was doing a lot of research for an exhibition on Robert L.B. Tobin, and I've been told that there was a rumor, a myth of Margaret Batts Tobin, his mother, seeing Nijinsky dance in Texas. And I thought that was really interesting, so did a lot of research and had a ton of sources and articles. And I was telling Caroline in our viewing room that I had read this amazing article about Nijinsky being in Texas in 1916, which would have made Margaret Batts Tobin 16 years old, and maybe she probably did go, and Ballets Russes was here in Texas. And she looked at me very seriously and she said, "Yes, Scott, I wrote that article." So I remembered all the details and all the important things, but I skimmed right past the author's name. So since that time, we have been wonderful colleagues and now good friends. And it has been lovely working for the past 2 years on this exhibition. It was also inspiring to see Dr. Hamilton share with some students last night, some ballet students, and engaging them in a riveting conversation about the Ballets Russes and its legacy and how it impacts them today. So having said all that, I'd like to thank Dr. Hamilton for her generosity, giving time and sharing her expertise on women artists of the Ballets Russes through the lens of Robert L.B. Tobin, the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts, not only with our students, but also with us this evening. So please please join me in welcoming Dr. Caroline Hamilton.
Hello, can you all hear me okay? All right, let's get this going. All right, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you so much to the McNay, to Matthew, to the Tobin Theatre Arts Fund, to Scott and to Remus Moore. I've had a wonderful few days here this week, and this is just the icing on the cake doing this. I love talking about the Ballets Russes, so this is very exciting. So for the first half of the talk tonight, I'm going to talk about the ideas and motivation behind the upcoming fall exhibition that will be in the Tobin Wing, Women Artists of the Ballets Russes. And I'm going to give you some sneak peeks in what you can expect to see from this exhibition. And then in the second half, I'm going to talk about how the costumes from the Ballets Russes survived and how some of them ended up in Texas. So the exhibition opening this fall is entitled Women Artists of the Ballets Russes. And you may be saying to yourself, that's an odd title, for, in the words of George Balanchine, ballet is woman. And in many ways, yes, and ballet is synonymous with women. And I'm sure if I asked you to just picture ballet in your head, you'd probably have an image of a tutu-clad ballerina spinning music book style. But so why devote a whole exhibition to this? And what is there to say? The truth is that the role of the ballerina is largely well documented, and the role of women in other positions other than center stage has often gone unrecorded or overlooked. In this exhibition, we will be exploring the female corps de ballet dancers, female costume makers and supervisors, female financial patrons, female designers, and the Ballets Russes' sole female choreographer. At the time of the Ballets Russes, we're talking 1909 to 1929, the majority of all roles, other than the ballerina, were undertaken by men, from production, management, patronage, design to choreography. Names you might have heard of: Diaghilev, Nijinsky, Bakst, Benoit, Stravinsky, Picasso, Matisse. This is not to say that women weren't there. It was just much more difficult for them to rise to these roles, and often those that did have not made it with such prominence into the pages of history. Even today, ballet is still largely a male-dominated industry, which may be surprising, with a disproportionate number of ballet choreographers and ballet directors being male. In 2022, the New York Times reported that women fill ballet's stages and classrooms, but choreographers and artistic directors, the people with power, are predominantly men. And at the 50 largest ballet companies in the United States, 71% of the artistic directors from founding to present have been men. This is slowly evolving and changing, with more and more women being appointed as directors and choreographers. So in this exhibition, we're hoping to show a different side to the Ballets Russes, using the incredible objects that are housed in the Tobin collection, and introduce you to some figures that you might not have met before. So the Ballets Russes was an incredible company, and you've all likely come across it in some form before. And I'm sure you recognize these wonderful images that are in the Tobin collection. And this really is what you think of what I think of when I think of the Ballets Russes. So just to give a little bit of context of why was this company so revolutionary and how did it invigorate ballet so much? So by the turn of the 20th century, ballet had actually largely fallen out of style in the majority of Western Europe. It was relegated to the stages of the music hall, to toe dancing, and it just really wasn't seen as an art form to be taken very seriously. However, ballet had held strong and continued to develop in the Russian Empire. And it is here in the late 19th century that many of the works we now associate synonymously with ballet were created, including the Nutcracker, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty. And these works continue to influence ballet to this day. I'm sure you've all seen one of those three at least. However, by the early 20th century, this style had become so codified and formulaic in Russia that ballerinas wore a corseted tutu and point shoes, whether they were being a princess or a gypsy or a swan. So a number of young dancers in Russia, composers and artists, sought to change this and began to experiment with shorter works that contained both choreography and designs that reflected the plot. Ultimately, this led to the creation of the Ballets Russes, led by impresario Serge Diaghilev. Initially, it was a seasonal company made up largely of imperial dancers on leave. The company premiered in Paris in 1909 and was a complete sensation of music, color, and movement. And it was a huge influence on everything from fashion to interior design. And I think you can really get a little bit of that majesty here. The early designs of Leon Bakst are indeed what most people associate with the company. And just to note, now this looks like such a beautiful classic imagery, but this was really revolutionary. And partly because the female dancers sat on the floor. And this was one of the first times that they had sat on the floor and the choreography was just their arms. Now that seems like a very commonplace thing to do. That'd be fine, but that was just, had never been done before. They also didn't wear tutus. They're wearing sort of harem-style pants, and they didn't wear point shoes. They wore shoes that matched the character, and that had never been done before. So from 1911, the company became a full-time enterprise, a Russian company that would never actually perform in Russia. The company would tour creating new and innovative works every season until Diaghilev's death in 1929. For 20 years, this company pushed ballet forward, and the impact is still being felt today. And arguably most of the ballet sort of diaspora in the US, even in the UK, in Australia, you can trace it back to this company. So these are some of the beautiful images from the Tobin collection that you really associate with the company. We have the beautiful Nijinsky here. So the pre-war years of the company were dominated by the incredible skills and appeal of Václav Nijinsky. He was both a dancer and became a choreographer. And indeed did spend a week in Texas in 1916. But did you know he had a younger sister, Bronislava Nijinská? Bronislava Nijinská, like her famous brother, was a graduate of the Mariinsky Ballet School and a member of the Imperial Ballet Company. This is pre-Russian Revolution, so they were members of the Tsar's household. She joined the Ballets Russes in 1909, later leaving the Imperial Ballet to dance full-time with the Ballets Russes, where she created many character roles. And you can see her here in the middle, in the Polotzian dances, and this is in Narcisse, and this is her graduation photo. This is the school uniform from the Imperial Ballet School, which I think is quite fabulous. So she actually returned to the Russian Empire in 1914, and it was here that she began to explore choreography and established a school of movement in Kiev in 1919. It was also here that she started to collaborate, there we go, with Alexandra Exter. And although Exter never worked with the Ballets Russes, in the mid-1920s, her collaboration with Nijinská in England is something that we're actually going to explore in this exhibition. The Tobin collection has a number of Exter designs, and here is a little sneak peek of what you might see in October. So in 1921, Nijinská left Russia never to return, and she rejoined the Ballets Russes. But this time, she didn't just join it as a dancer, even though you can see her in this wonderful 20s makeup here in The Sleeping Princess. She joined as a choreographer. So she recreated some of the pieces for The Sleeping Princess, which was the Ballets Russes' version of Sleeping Beauty. It was the only full-length ballet the company actually ever did. All the other ballets that we talk about, Firebird, Scheherazade, Les Sylphides, they were quite short, and you would actually see 3 in an evening. So this was the only work that was a full evening-length work, and it actually wasn't very successful. People didn't want to see that. But that's what brought her back into the company. So she created some additional little dances for that. But then she began creating some more modern and some more slightly strange things, but very impactful. So the company had, in the intervening years, continued to strive forward, creating much more ephemeral works that pushed the bounds of music design and choreography. So as well as reworking older choreography and creating new dance sections for opera, because a lot of people forget that the Ballets Russes also were doing operas at the same time, not just ballets. She created 8 ballets for the Ballets Russes between 1922 and 1926. And these works are still incredibly modern even today. I'm not pointing this thing very well, am I? There we go. These are some of the pieces that she'd actually danced in. So she actually danced the role of this fox here, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And these are both in the Tobin collection. So this is one of her works, Les Noces, which is choreographed to Stravinsky score. It has 4 pianos on stage, and there are some videos of it on YouTube. I highly recommend looking it up because it is still, even 101 years later, so modern. It is absolutely incredible piece. And you can see here the way she sort of structured and choreographed these dances. So this is actually on the roof of the theatre in Monte Carlo. They were doing a sort of outdoor practice session. And here, so this is one of the times that she collaborated with Natalia Goncharova, who I'm going to speak a little bit more about later. But you can see here, this is not so much a costume design, it's really choreographic. They're really talking about, how they're going to arrange these dances, almost sort of like sculpture. So after leaving the Ballets Russes, Nijinská went on to work in Argentina and in the late 20s before returning to Europe to work with the Ida Rubinstein Company, before creating her own company in 1931. And throughout the 1930s, she would continue to work on her own projects as well as for other ballet companies. She moved to the US in the late 1930s, where she became influential in training the first wave of American-born dancers, including Native American ballerina Maria Tallchief. And it's this concept of legacy, the legacy from these women and from the Ballets Russes, that we're going to explore in the second section of the exhibition, Women Artists of the Ballets Russes. There's also this wonderful photo of her coaching in 1942 at Jacob's Pillow. And if you don't know, Jacob's Pillow is a dance festival in Western Massachusetts, which has been going since the early 1930s. And she taught there in 1941 and 1942. And if you're interested in learning more about Nijinská, I would highly recommend Lynn Garofola's new book, La Nijinská, Choreographer of the Modern, which came out, I think, last year. So Nijinská was the only female choreographer that the Ballets Russes employed, and her works are fantastic at reflecting the sort of ephemeral nature of these pieces in the 1920s. They're so different from the buxed, kind of opulent Scheherazade that we saw at first. So the company was known for employing artists to create costumes and set designs as opposed to stage designers. And this resulted in incredible sets and costumes that the company is known for. 4 of these artists were women. Have I missed a slide? I've gone the wrong way. Well, I'll start with that one. So Marie Laurenson, she created the designs for Les Biches, which was one of Nijinská's 1920s works. And here you can actually see Nijinská in costume for Les Biches in this wonderful sort of 20s dress. She's got strings and strings of pearls and this very long cigarette holder, which I think is rather fabulous. Okay. Sonia Delaunay recreated designs for Cleopatra in 1918. So quite often the ballets were recreated. So Cleopatra originally premiered in 1910 with designs by Buxt, but a lot of the costumes and sets were actually lost when they were in South America. There was a fire in the train, and the car that had all the sets and costumes caught fire. So all those sets were lost. So she redesigned the costumes for Cleopatra in 1918. I don't know where I'm supposed to point this thing. There we go. And this is her amazing costume, filigree, that she designed for the role of Cleopatra. Unfortunately, the costume will not be coming to the exhibition, but we will have some of these incredible photographs. And this is Lyubov Chenicheva, who had been an imperial ballerina and danced with the Ballets Russes from 1909 all the way to 1929. And she created many of these beautiful character roles. And then fashion designer Gabrielle Coco Chanel. Did you know that she designed for ballet? She did. She designed 2 of the ballets for the Ballets Russes. The first one was Le Trembleur, which was another Nijinská ballet. And this, although this looks very dated now, this was incredibly modern. Remember, this is before the leotard is invented. So seeing these dancers in these rather risque bathing suits at the time would have been really quite fun. So this was a sort of commentary on Monte Carlo life, on the kind of opulence of all these sort of seaside resorts. And Chanel designed these wonderful bathing costumes. They're knitted wool. They can't have been that fun to actually dance in, but they're quite fun. And actually, if any of you were in London recently, the big Coco Chanel exhibition actually had a couple of these costumes there, which was really wonderful. So, but Chanel also designed a second version of costumes for the first premiere of Balanchine's Apollo, which again, a lot of people don't realize. So she was really interested in ballet, and she'd actually been involved in the Ballets Russes for quite a long time as an anonymous financial patron. So as an independent woman of means, she was a financial patron of the company. So patronage was something that was an acceptable interest for wealthy ladies in Paris at the time. And Diaghilev was the beneficiary of a number of female patrons, including Lady Juliette Duff, Misa Sert, who was actually with Diaghilev when he died, and the Princess de Polignac, who was the heiress to the Singer sewing machine fortune. There we go. Okay. And the final female designer is perhaps the one you might recognize the most, and certainly the one that is best represented in the Tobin collection. And this is Natalia Goncharova. So Goncharova was an incredible artist in her own right, and with her partner, Mikhail Larionov. So Goncharova began collaborations with the Ballets Russes in 1914. The first work that she created was the Golden Cockerel, Le Coq d'Or, and this was her first commission. So we are actually going to be showing some costumes, designs, and a set piece from the 1937 production. So the ballet was redone with just ballet. Originally it had opera as well, redone in 1937, and Goncharova created new designs. So this is an incredible set piece. This is the tent of the Queen of Shamakhan. And you can see it on stage here. This is a stage photograph taken in Australia with the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo. And it rose up out of the stage, sort of Nutcracker Christmas tree style. Little sneak peek, we are going to be showing this set piece, which is very exciting. And it is going to be reunited for the first time since performance with the Queen of Shamakhan, which is this absolutely incredible cape that she only wore very briefly. She came on stage and you can see them holding it at the back here. But it is absolutely beautiful, this sort of pomegranate design. And this cape not only is beautiful because it was designed by Natalia Goncharova, it was worn by baby ballerina Irina Baronova, but it was made by Barbara Korinska. And this might be a name you've heard of because Barbara Korinska was also a fellow Russian emigre. And she was incredibly talented costume maker beginning in the 1930s. So she would eventually settle in the US and became the principal costume maker and designer for George Balanchine and New York City Ballet. So Jules, Serenade, all those wonderful pieces were made and designed by Barbara Korinska. So after the Golden Cockerel, the next work that Goncharova worked on was Liturgy. And Liturgy is a really interesting piece because it was designed, the choreography was started, the music was started, but it was never performed. So this was created when there was just a tiny nucleus of the company left in Switzerland in 1915. So World War I is raging in Europe, so the company kind of disbanded and a little group stayed together. But the Tobin collection has quite a lot of these absolutely beautiful designs. And I've always wondered, what would these costumes have looked like? What would this choreography have been like? And then the next piece she worked on is probably my favorite. So this is the ballet Sadko. So again, this was actually a reworking of an older ballet that they had done in 1911. And Diaghilev decided he wanted some jazzier costumes. And I think you'll agree, these are pretty jazzy. So here we have a seahorse. And here we have, it's often called a squid and octopus, but it is actually, there were 10 of these costumes and these dances, and they were the sea, basically. They were the sea current. So this was a whole underwater ballet, which I think is just absolutely wonderful. And we are going to be showing a few pieces from this. And this is a photograph from this ballet. And you can see this is actually the original 1909 set. And then these are the 1916 costumes. And this was taken in New York in 1916. And it's absolutely, the clarity of the photograph here doesn't do it justice, but it is really beautiful. You can really see the detail of these costumes. So in the mid-1920s, Goncharova collaborated with Nijinsky in a number of works, which we've already seen a little bit of. Okay. Including Les Noces and some of the other pieces that I've already given you a little sneak peek of. But in 1926, she created new designs for the ballet Firebird, which had premiered in 1910 with designs by Golovin and Bakst. So again, she was asked to create a new version for Diaghilev. And it included this absolutely incredible backdrop that is now at the V&A Museum in London. And we are going to be showing a costume that was worn by the beautiful Tsarina, the princess in Firebird. So this costume has only just been recently identified, and this will be the first time it will have been shown, which is really exciting. So it was worn by Lyubov Chenicheva in 1926, and then it was actually worn by her daughter-in-law in the 1930s. And again, I love that idea of legacy, of passing these costumes down. So that's going to be a really beautiful moment. And the making of these costumes was supervised by Vera Sudakina, who was the wife of Serge Sudakin, who was an artist, and then she went on to marry Stravinsky. Okay. So you might recognize this photograph and this person. So you'll have seen that the exhibition is going to be drawing from designs and photographs, but a lot of original costumes. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about why ballet costumes are such interesting sources and then how they have survived. So I'm sure you'll all agree that ballet is essentially an ephemeral art form. It exists in the moment of live performance. And whilst film and photography are able to capture an echo of this, these forms of documentation only capture one facet of the performance, and they don't always exist. Diaghilev notoriously would not have the company filmed, even though the technology was there. So one place where a dance historian can glean information is from the surviving costumes, where when they survive, they often remain the only tangible link to these productions. So ballet costumes are unique working objects. They are central to the performance, and they are inhabited and shaped by the bodies of the dancers who performed in them. They are made for specific characters in specific ballets, and they're very rarely used in alternate productions, unlike theatre, where that happens much more often. They are built to have a life of over 20 years, a practice which continues today. And they are altered to fit successive waves of dancers. The fabrics and applied decorations are all chosen to best interpret the designer's vision and the choreographer's movement. As such, they represent integrated sites of performance and design. So the centrality of costume to ballet performance means that as objects, they continue to hold information long after the ballet is over. So hasty written names, alterations, detailed repairs, sweat stains, the residue of makeup, they can all provide us insights into production, casting, even choreography. And many of these details aren't available from any other source. And perhaps most importantly, I think, they add color, because quite often we just have black and white photographs, or we have the design, but that was just an idea, that was just the initial concept, that wasn't actually what was on stage. So the original costumes can give us a definite answer, and I would argue that these costumes need to be seen as works of art in their own right, connected to but separate from the designs, but also as working objects that were physically present during the production and performance process, and they carry valuable traces of evidence and experience. But how did these costumes end up in Texas? Okay, so after the closure of the Ballets Russes in 1929, when Diaghilev died, the company's costumes, props, and backplots, about 50 ballets worth, were bought by former Ballets Russes dancer and choreographer Leonid Massin, actually with the hopes of starting a ballet company here in the US. But unfortunately, the Wall Street crash and many other things meant that that did not come to fruition. So instead, Massin joined the newly formed Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo. Massin was a great choice for them because not only could he choreograph new and popular works, but he could also restage a lot of the Ballets Russes and Diaghilev era works. So the costumes and sets that he had were eventually purchased for use in the company, and approximately 24 revivals from the Ballets Russes repertoire were ultimately staged using the original sets and costumes. And that's why you've seen with the Firebird that I mentioned, it had been worn later, and that was worn by the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo. So the other half of these costumes, the ones that were not being used, were put into storage in London and Paris. During World War II, the costumes were moved from London during the Blitz to Montreal. However, although they were safe from the Blitz in Montreal, ultimately the majority of them were destroyed by water damage from a warehouse fire. It wasn't actually the fire, but it was the water, and they were left wet through a Montreal winter. So only a small selection of those costumes survived, and they're at the Royal Ontario Museum. And unfortunately, a lot of those ballets were the more ephemeral 1920s ballets that I have mentioned previously. So we only have a little indication of what they were. So after Colonel de Basil's death in 1951, the sets and costumes are now a mix of both Ballets Russes and the subsequent Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo company, were returned to the control of the foundation that had purchased them and put into storage, where they were kind of forgotten about. A small selection were used in the 1954 Diaghilev exhibition that was curated by Richard Buckle. And here are some photographs from that exhibition. And I think it's really interesting. I'll just put this out there. We will not display costumes like this anymore. I don't advise putting them on the floor or draping them like this, but it was really innovative at the time. So they created this sort of backstage set area. The idea was it was the sort of ghosts of the dancers. And then this is a dressing room. Not sure what happened to this person. But this was one of the first times that costumes were actually used in an exhibition, because often, and still quite often, designs are preferred over the costumes for many reasons. So by the 1960s, struggling with the cost of storage, the last surviving member of the foundation that owned all these costumes decided he needed to try and offload this huge collection, basically. And he tried to sell the whole collection, but no one was very interested. So in 1967, Sotheby's in London held a small auction, mainly of Ballet Russe designs and ephemera, but it also included 24 costumes that had been owned by former ballet master Serge Grigoriev, and some of them had been in that exhibition, which is why they'd sort of left the Paris storage. These are two of my absolute favorite photographs. So these are taken at the preview of the auction in 1967. And this is Imperial ballerina Tamara Kasavina reunited with Nijinsky's costume from Der Bleu, and she had danced the female role. And I just love this sort of reverence of her seeing this piece again. And then my personal favorite over here, this is Lydia Sokolova, and you can see just the joy in seeing her old costume again. And this was her costume in Nijinsky's Les Biches. Lydia Sokolova, I'm a big fan of. She was actually born Hilda Munnings in Essex, but she reinvented herself. And she joined the Ballet Russe in 1913, so very early for a non-Russian speaker. She did learn Russian, and she danced with the company all the way through to 1929. And if you're interested in more the sort of backstage life of this company, her biography that was published in the 60s is well worth a read. It's quite a lot of fun. Okay. So the auction was a real success, and it demonstrated that anything to do with the Ballet Russe was a sought-after commodity. So the last member of the foundation decided that he would try and sell this whole collection through Sotheby's. And it was dance critic and writer Richard Buckle that Sotheby's turned to when approached with this immense collection of costumes and sets. And Richard Buckle's archive is all at the Harry Ransom Center, and it's absolutely incredible, all his notes from this time. So I want to read out a little bit of a quote. So he was flown over to Paris to look at this big collection. He went into this dusty old warehouse, and he describes rushing from hamper to hamper. I exclaimed, there are Goncharva's costumes from Cocteau. This is Picasso's acrobat from Parade. Good Lord, these Chinese costumes are the one Matisse designed for Stravinsky's Nightingale. How fantastic. These must be Bach's crazy Oriental costumes from Le Der Bleu, which was never given again after 1912. Pulling out a gorgeously embroidered 18th century coat, immediately identified as a creation by Bakst from The Sleeping Princess, that most lavish of all spectacles, we assumed because of its splendor that it was worn by a king or Prince Charming. But no, there were 5 more like it. It was just one of the courtiers in the background. And I could go on, but I think that just shows this real excitement of them rushing around finding all these things that they didn't know were still there. But it is important to remember that what survives isn't always an indication of success. So, for example, only 2 costumes survive from the company's arguably most successful work, La Sylphide, and that's because they were just worn and worn until they fell apart. The same for Scheherazade, which we saw at the beginning. That was so successful, it was remade and patched and reworn so many times that the pieces that do survive are not from the original. The most intact works are the ones that were arguably the least successful, like Der Bleu or Sadko, the underwater ballet I showed you, because they weren't performed very often. Even Sleeping Beauty, that was given up after 1 season. So those costumes are the ones that are in the best condition. So ultimately, the collection of surviving Ballet Russe material would be sold in 3 auctions, 1968, 1969, and 1973. The first 2 auctions were treated as lavish theatrical events, and here are some slides from those. Students from the Royal Ballet School modelled the costumes, something I do not advise doing now, but different time. And my good friend Lydia Sokolova choreographed poses for them, echoing the choreography. And here you can see the dancers. This is all them wearing costumes from Sleeping Princess. Here is Sokolova at the front, and they actually were able to fly all the backdrops. And this is the wonderful backdrop that Picasso designed that is now at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So Robert Tobin bought costumes from the 1968 auction, whereas the costumes that are at the Harry Ransom Centre were purchased in 1969. So here is one of the costumes that is now here, the Tobin collection. This is the Master of Ceremonies from Sleeping Princess, and this is how it appeared in the auction catalogue in 1968. Here's some of the other photographs. So here is actually a little sneak peek. We're going to be showing costumes from both this ballet Narcisse and my underwater ballet Sadko. And they tried very hard to make sure that they matched up the right ballet to the right costume, but this was a huge undertaking and some things slipped through the net. So this costume over here is actually a man's costume, and it's actually back to front in this photograph. And it actually goes with this headdress, but that's okay. And this is also a man's costume. But it also shows you that at the time, still the designs were definitely more prized. And then as you sort of move down, the actual physical set pieces went for thousands, if not tens of thousands of pounds, where you could have bought an original bust costume for £10. I mean, some of them went for a couple of hundred, but that would have had to have been worn by Nijinsky. So they really weren't prized quite as much. And you can see here actually in this advertisement for the 1973 auction, they were advertising it as come and find something fun to wear. So yes. But luckily, although I have heard quite a few people did go and buy things to wear to their parties in the 70s, the majority of costumes did end up in museums, archives, and art galleries like here. So the 3 largest collections around the world now are the Theatre Museum in London, which is now part of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Dance Museum in Stockholm, and interestingly, the National Gallery of Australia. So the National Gallery of Australia was just establishing at the time, and they had, as we all know, tiny budgets to get going. So the director was on a buying trip in London, and he realized that this was a way that he could buy a Goncharova, a Matisse, a Picasso. So they bought a lot of costumes in the 1973 auction, and they were one of the first to really treat these pieces as works of art in their own right, which I think is very exciting. But I'm just going to list off where all these costumes have ended up. And this is by no means the entire list, but there is Allard Pearson in Amsterdam, the Allen Memorial Art Museum in Ohio, the Ballets Russes Archive, the University of Oklahoma, the Harry Ransom Center, Austin, the John Bright Collection, London, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the McNay, the Museum of London, the Nouveau Museo National de Monaco, the State Museum of Theatre and Music, St. Petersburg, University of Arts, London, the Wadsworth Athenaeum, Hertford, and the Whitworth University of Manchester. So I really want to show you that this, although there's only a small collection of costumes here, it's part of a much bigger web. And in some cases, one costume that you have here, there is its friend in London, and its other friend in the National Gallery of Australia. So they're all over the world now. Okay, so just a few last little things that I wanted to comment on. So for this exhibition, we really want to focus on the unknown stories of the women artists involved, choreographers, designers, patrons and makers, and to reunite costumes with photographs and designs, but also to show them as works of art and working objects in their own rights, highlighting not only who designed them, which has often been the case and was often men, but also who made them, who realized these designs into incredible wearable and, most importantly, danceable costumes, and who wore them. And also who designed the back of them? So this is something that I was commenting on, that most of the designers never actually drew the back of the costume, and that was up to the costume maker. So just to give you a little insight into some of the research I've been doing and some of the sort of behind the scenes work and some of the things that you will see. So the very first costume that you will see at this exhibition is this beautiful costume from Narcisse. This is a beautiful bust piece. You can see his design here. And this is coming from the Harry Ransom Center. And it's actually going to be shown in quite an innovative way. You're actually going to be able to see inside the costume. And you're going to be able to see the labels inside. This is one of the really important things with ballet costumes. If any of you were dancers and wore somebody else's costume, probably the first thing you did was see the names inside. And this is just a history that goes far back. It's always been done that way. But what is interesting about this costume is we knew who designed it, we knew the ballet, but we didn't know who made it or who wore it. So this labeling inside here has the name of the ballet, the character, and then the dancer. And I was able to track down that this was Alexandra Wasliewska, who danced with the company between 1911 and 1920. So this was made for her in the first cast of the company. And then probably wondering what this little label up here is. This is a German customs stamp. So every piece of costume, and I mean every piece of costume, had to be stamped with a Russian customs stamp between 1909 and 1912. It's a great way of being able to date some of these early costumes. But I didn't know who had made it, and I was able to, by the way that this labeling is done and the handwriting, match it to a couple of other costumes and work out that this costume was made in Russia. So quite a few of the first ballets, up until about 1912, they still had all the costumes and sets made in Russia. But often the designer wasn't in Russia. So the way they would do it is they would send the designs, and then the maker would create these pieces. And in this case, the maker was Ivan Kafi, who had been a designer and maker for the Imperial Theatre and then set up on his own. And then the costumes would be sent to wherever the company was. And to make sure that they knew exactly, which design correlated, they did this quite elaborate labeling system. So this doesn't appear in all the costumes. And in some cases, they even number, this is design number 6, this is design number 7. But it was really interesting to realize that this is actually who made these costumes. And then if I can get it to work, my last slide. So I just want to end again with this concept of legacy and what these costumes can tell you. So this is a costume from here, from the Tobin collection. This is for one of the pink pages in Sleeping Princess. There were 4 of these costumes. The Tobin has 1. And this was just a sort of walk-on role. This wasn't a dancing role. You can see a beautiful, elaborate costume, but it was still just a sort of courtier. And this was worn by a young man called Patrick K, who danced under the name Patrick F. Make it a little more Russian. So Patrick F, he just had this little walk-on part, and it was very exciting. And this was his first big professional role with the Ballets Russes. This young man went on to be Anton Dolan, which is a name you might have heard of. Anton Dolan went on to be a very famous dancer with the Ballets Russes. He was a founding member of the Vic Wells Company, which became the Royal Ballet. He ran the Markova Dolan Company with Ballet Russe ballerina Alicia Markova. And he was a founding member of Ballet Theatre, which is now American Ballet Theatre. And here he is in the middle, looking rather dashing. And this is him at Jacob's Pillow in 1941. So a number of the dancers had just left the Ballet Russes de Monte Carlo to start this new company, this ballet theatre, this American company. And they rented Jacob's Pillow for the summer. It's quite literally just a farm in the woods, but it had a number of studios, and they just created for this summer. But just in terms of this concept of legacy, so you have Anton Dolan, who had danced with the Ballets Russes, next to Alicia Markova here in a wonderful 40s bathing suit, who had also been a Ballets Russes dancer. In the front here is Irina Baronova, who is the next generation. She had left Russia as a child and grown up as a Russian emigre in Paris, training with former imperial dancers. And she was one of Balanchine's baby ballerinas. She created the role of the Queen of Shamakhan. And then over here, we have Nora Kay, one of the first American-born ballerinas. And here they are all working together. Nijinsky was also here coaching and training them, creating this new American company. And it's really that concept of legacy and inheritance through this, originally this small company coming out of Russia, that we really want to highlight, and particularly all these incredible women that were both on stage and off stage. So thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Caroline, for that amazing talk that allowed us to gain more context as to how we here at the McNay fit into this legacy through the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts. And so now we'd like to open up the floor to some questions. If you've been thinking about something over the past 30, 40 minutes that's been, a question you've wanted to ask,
or if you need a moment to think, I realized I forgot a funny story about
So while you think about a question.
What do you think? Okay, so the beautiful golden cockerel costumes made in 1937, and I mentioned Barbara Korinska. So although Barbara Korinska was an absolutely wonderful, meticulous costume maker, she was notoriously always late in delivering the costumes. And my favorite story, which I really, really hope is true, but please take it with a grain of salt, was that on opening night of the Golden Cockerel, and this is at the Royal Opera House in London in 1937, and as I said, these ballets were performed normally 3 in an evening. So the first ballet had happened, there were no costumes for the Golden Cockerel, it was premiering. Second ballet happened, still no costumes. So all the dancers are sitting in their dressing rooms in their tights and their headdresses and nothing else, waiting for these costumes. And they kept extending the intermission and extending it and trying to schmooze everyone. And Irina Baronova, the young dancer I mentioned, writes in her biography that she was sitting there waiting and she suddenly heard all these sirens. And, the Royal Opera House has a little alleyway at the back. She leaned out the window and saw 2 or 3 ambulances coming out. Oh my gosh, what's happened? And the ambulances all stopped, the doors burst open, and there was Korinska with the costume rails. I don't know how she had convinced the ambulance drivers to do this, but that's how the costumes got there. And apparently they went on stage in all the wrong costumes. It was just get it on, pinned on. But I absolutely love that story because you think of these dances, it's just such a beautiful art form, looks so refined, but really, it's a bit of a mess going on backstage sometimes. So yes, any questions?
I had heard that the Duke of Devonshire at the Chatsworth had bought a bunch of the costumes.
So not that I know of at Chatsworth, but
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yes, sorry. Was asked about whether some of the costumes were bought Duke of Devonshire. Yes. I don't know about that, but there were definitely costumes bought by Castle Howard. So Lord Howard. So he bought a lot of costumes, and he had his own little museum. And those costumes, most of them are now at the Dance Museum in Stockholm. And actually, he was the original purchaser of the Queen of Shamakhan, which is coming to us, which is very exciting. But no, I'll have to follow that up. Lots of people did purchase them, and a lot of people then donated them, particularly in the UK, to the Theatre Museum. So it's possible that that's how that came into being.
I was remembering that several years ago we had Victoria Tennant, the actress, speak here, and she is the daughter of Baronova.
She is,
right?
yes.
That correct?
That
yes,
is
I
correct.
thought so.
Yes.
Yeah, you may all remember her as the wife of Steve Martin.
Yes, so her mother was Irina Baronova.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, question way in the back.
Hi. In your research, have you found any old films that were? Oh, I'm sorry, there was like a whole Beyonce one.
Hi. Yes, that's better. I didn't know there was a Beyonce moment. I'm sorry. Sofiane speaking. I'm the artistic director of Ballet San Antonio. So I'm very
Thank you.
intrigued about, in your research, did you find movies, old movies from the time they was able to have movies on Les Présages de Massine? I mean, they are old films. I was wondering if your research, you found a little bit of images that way, because obviously it doesn't go back all the way back to Les Ballets Russes, but I was wondering if you had found any treasures.
Yeah, so there is no film footage of the Ballets Russes, but stand corrected, there is a teeny tiny piece of footage of them performing La Sylphide outside in Berlin in the late 1920s. But I think Diaghilev didn't know that was happening, otherwise he wouldn't have allowed that. So there is no footage of the Ballets Russes actually dancing the pieces, but there is quite a lot of footage of the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo dancing some Massine pieces. There's some wonderful footage of the Golden Cockerel. A lot of that was actually taken in Australia, where the company toured in the late 1930s. So there's quite a lot of sort of backstage footage. So there's definitely been a lot of research that's happened there in kind of collating some of this footage. And we are going to show a few little snippets in the exhibition. But yes, there isn't a huge amount from the early period. The only person that really, ballerina at the time, that sort of embraced that technology was actually Anna Pavlova. And she only wanted herself filmed. So and there are only films of her, not the rest of her company. So people actually forget she danced with a company of sometimes up to 50 dancers, but it was just her that got photographed and got filmed. But there's still a fantastic record of the choreography and of technique at the time.
Any other questions?
Oh, I think the mic's just coming to you.
I think I can speak so that everyone can hear me online.
Very good.
Can you hear me? My background years ago was in literary history, and I don't know very much about dance history, although I had daughters who were dancers, and we had daughters who were dancers. It inspired me to want to learn more about this. But you mentioned the ephemera and the ephemeral nature of art, and I'm curious. Does that affect the ability of these very imaginative artists, the women who are designing these costumes, to have an influence? In other words, I don't, this is really wonderful. I'm looking forward to the exhibit. But I'm wondering, somebody like Julie Taymor, who I know a little bit about, she was too young to, see any of this live. And I don't know where, since you weren't McNay and other people bring on these exhibits, is she just another flowering of creativity, or is there influence passed on by this flowering of creativity?
Oh, I think there's absolutely influence.
I mean, outside the music.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Often the music is the thing that people recognize most. And people often don't realize that things like Firebird were a ballet first, and they were this, whole collaboration. But I think what is important, although I talk about this ephemeral nature, they were designed to be ephemeral at the time. The company that Scott mentioned that my PhD was called Ballet 33. It was only ever designed to be the ballets of 1933. That was it. They were to be performed, created. They were of that moment. They weren't to be repeated. And I think actually some of these designers and choreographers would be appalled that we're still doing these versions. They'd be like, can't you do something new? Because the idea was that it was just this moment. It was this creative coming together. And I think, again, what is important to note at the time, you mentioned the music, is it was all being created together, with the exception of things like Golden Cockerel that used existing music. Firebird, for example, that was composed, choreographed, and designed collaboratively. There's wonderful descriptions of Stravinsky at the piano and Fokine sort of climbing over it, being like, oh, we'll climb over the wall at this point. Okay, let's do this. And they were all working together to create this. It wasn't sort of like, the score was created, then they layered on the choreography, and then the designer came in and layered on that. It was much more collaborative. I'm not sure that completely answered your question, but I hope that sparked something, of course.
So we have time for one last question. Oh, perfect.
I may be confused, but do you know if Nora Kay was married to the violinist Kajak Sturm?
I don't know that. I don't know. But possibly. But we can find out.
Well, again, I'd like to thank Dr. Hamilton for coming in. The Women of the Ballets Russes will be our fall 2024 exhibition. if you are interested in coming out and seeing some more wonderful artworks from the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts, we will be opening Around the World in 80 Designs on May 2nd through the summer. And during that time, we will continue our co-curatorial work on the Ballets Russes exhibition. And I just want to, again, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to recontextualize the holdings that we have, which I think is something that Robert Tobin would really like. He would like us looking at this new, at these objects in a new way and bringing new life to them and new scholarship. I'm very excited, and I'll share with you that the scholarship that Caroline is putting together will have life beyond this exhibition, linking Robert Tobin and the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts to this through line of women artists. So we're very excited about that. And thank you again very much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you. That's okay. Good. Yeah, it was okay. Hi. Oh, thank you.